Okay, good morning. This is Alex Wright, and he's presenting on written corrective feedback in the digital context. Alex, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to meet you. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I'm living in Sendai in Japan, but I'm from Canada originally. I'm a master's student and part-time lecturer at Miyagi Gakuin Women's University. And this is my first JALT presentation and my first online presentation, so I'm a little nervous, but let's get into it. So today I'm going to talk about written corrective feedback in a digital context. First, I'm going to introduce my writing class and kind of how I do it. I'm going to go into the outline of a little experiment I did, talk about the results, and then the conclusions. So about my writing class, it's a second year intermediate level writing class with 18 students. So a nice small class, good for one-on-one time, but not that great for sample size when I'm trying to do research. Uses the basic textbook, Basic Steps to Academic Writing by Taylor and Kluge. We follow it pretty loosely, but it gives us the background to study a bunch of different paragraph types like self-introduction, descriptive, comparison, and so on. So this is our typical 4-class cycle. Students generally get feedback in between writing their first draft and second draft, and they'll write 3 drafts in total. And for the past few years, the teachers have been doing this class as a computer-based writing class. So I'll just go into how we do that a little bit. All students write on electronic devices. So I recommend that they use computers, but I'm sure some of them have tried using smartphones. It's just really difficult to lay things out properly and nicely on a smartphone. All assignments are shared with the teacher through Google Workspace. I'm not sponsored by Google or anything. I just find this to be a very effective way. I'll explain why. So they first make a Gmail account on the first day. They add the teacher to the contacts. And then as soon as they make any document, they share it with the teacher using the share button. After they do this, I can see when any changes are made at any time and all previous versions of the document, which is really handy for research as well. So how did feedback work prior to my study? So I'm not the first person to teach this class. I also have to give credit to Mr. Corey Kobe and Kyle McLaughlin, but they had been giving a mix of direct and indirect feedback. I'll get into what I mean by those in a second, but after every draft. And they use Google Documents suggestion feature for direct feedback and correction codes for indirect feedback. The choice of which to use was kind of at their discretion at any moment, as far as I know. So the suggestion feature is kind of like other word processing software like Microsoft Word, where you can track changes. You basically suggest something and send the document back to the author and they can accept or reject it. Correction codes look something like this. So we might write a 2 or 3 letter code in red at some space and expect the student to correct that mistake. So about these correction codes, we have a list that was compiled by the Miyagi Gakuin teachers. I'm not exactly sure where they got it from, but it's very similar to other popular lists like from the British Council or Academic English UK. If you just Google a correction code list, you'll find a bunch of similar ones. Students are provided with a lesson on how to use these codes and given a guide sheet. And I have a little sample here of the first couple. So art for article, cap for capitalize this word, conj for conjunction, and then a kind of example that I would give a student. So this situation left me wondering as I started this class, when exactly should I use a certain type of feedback? I'm not very confident in my ability to choose it. Is one type strictly better than another, and which type might be the best for the majority of my current students? So I'll get into the little experiment that I did. First, some background. So what do I mean by direct feedback and indirect feedback? So I'll use this quote from Ferris. Direct feedback, that is explicit corrections provided by the teacher or another reader. Indirect feedback, that is an error called to the student's attention, whether through more or less explicit means, but left for the student to correct. So I think most people in the literature agree with this kind of dissection of feedback, but it's not that simple. A lot of other categories have also been recognized, and it becomes not a black and white case of indirect and direct, but more of a gradient. So far on the direct far on the indirect side, we might have like, this document is insufficient, but you don't give any more detail than that. And as you go up, you might have, okay, in this paragraph, in this sentence, at this location, you might start giving hints. It's a spelling mistake, it's a tense mistake. And then fully direct would be maybe just rewriting as you think it should be in the correct way. So there are studies that show better results with more direct methods and studies that show better results with indirect methods. I think there are more that show better results with indirect. And there are some studies that fail to show significant difference, but I don't think there's a consensus on really the best time to be using a certain type of feedback. Interestingly, some survey results show that students and teachers prefer direct in general. It might just be less work on both sides. So I'll get into the methods of what I did. So I decided to spend half of my semester, about 2 units, with only direct feedback and switch to only indirect correction code-based feedback for the second half, about 2 units. I obtained quantitative grammar data through accuracy pre-tests and post-tests, and obtained more qualitative student opinions via questionnaire. I say qualitative, but I'll be representing this data as the number of students with certain opinions. That's why it has a star. And I considered my own position, how the feedback types affected me. So about the grammar tests, I used Google Forms. It was pretty easy, and I made all the tests. If I was going to do this again, I don't think I would make the tests. It's just very difficult to keep consistency with difficulty and keep my bias out of things. But I made 24 option multiple choice questions, and the test was closed book. I attempted to target 1 to 3 grammar points per question. Lower would be ideal, but when I have multiple choice with 4 different answers, it's hard to only be targeting one thing when they have to choose. And the pre and post tests were identical. They were given approximately 2 months apart, before and after using one feedback type. They were not for grades, but for a participation score, and students were not shown the results. And I got permission from the students to use their data for research. So there's a bit of a distinction to be made when I'm testing all of these grammar points. I could be testing grammar that I taught in class, and that's kind of including my ability to teach them in their test score. And it's generally easier. The textbook has some pretty easy grammar points. Then there's grammar that was not taught, and this kind of includes the student's chance to find and remember solutions to these points on their own. And when I made these type of questions, I selected them from problem areas of the previous year. So I chose to use 10 questions of each of these types. For the questionnaire questions, these were the main questions. So what did you think about X feedback? What was the main reason you liked X feedback? Which feedback did you prefer? What resource did you mainly use to correct errors? And what was your main problem with X feedback? And those questions were asked in Japanese, translated by me, to make it easier for students to understand. So let's get into some results. I'll first talk about the grammar that I taught in class. This ended up being not very useful in my case. It's just a case of it was too easy, or rather the students knew how to use them pretty well. So there was no room for their scores to grow. I'm going to lay it out here in table 1. So I have how I would kind of define that grammar point, then a piece of the answer, so you can see a bit of the language that I used in the actual question, and the number of correct answers in the pre-test and post-test. So the max would be 18 for 18 students. These are starting at 17, 17, 18, 18. So there's no room to grow really, not much to see. There are a few cases of kind of bigger increases or decreases. There was room to decrease, as you see. I kind of hope this one was an outlier, but I'll certainly be looking into the way I taught sensory smell to see if it was confusing or anything. So it might be interesting to look at these few individual cases, but I'm more interested in the data set and if there was any statistical improvement. Then looking at the indirect part of the semester. So I have new grammar points because we studied new units, made new questions, And kind of the same situation, there wasn't much room to grow. There was a few cases of big differences, so it might be interesting to study these individual cases. Like my students really didn't know that they can use the word star as a verb, as in the movie stars, the actors, Brad Pitt, and so on. And in the post-test, 7 of them got the answer right. So there's some growth there, but I still have a ways to go if I want everyone to be using that correctly. So anyway, these sets were not too useful. There's not a significant difference between the data sets. What about if I look at the grammar that I did not teach in class? Was it any different? So this time it was more difficult. The students started much lower in the pre-test. You can see the grammar points are a little bit more difficult here. And there was more room to grow. Did they grow? Not really. There's really only one case of a difference of 4. How about in the indirect feedback portion of the semester? So this time, because they didn't really grow in the first semester, I decided to keep the same type of grammar points, but I did make new questions, just kind of using new nouns and adjectives and changing the sentence around a bit. But this time there was actually quite a few big increases for several questions. So that was pretty interesting. If we look at the actual statistics, I'll represent this data, same data in just a different perspective. So using the students, A, B, C, D, and so on as the independent variable and their score out of 10 on that section of the test out of 10. I then did a related samples Wilcoxon signed rank test for significance, whether the change was significant. And it turns out that it was, P equals 0.006. So this was the only data set that had a significant increase. So that was pretty interesting. So I don't think we can really say that this increase was because of indirect feedback. This wasn't a very well-controlled experiment. I don't know that the students didn't just go to a grammar class after my class and learn some of these points, but I'll try to convince you that indirect feedback helped several students perhaps change their way of thinking and maybe help them get increased scores. So were the increases actually due to incorrect feedback? Are there concrete examples? Let's look at this example of Chihiro. So because of Google Documents archiving, I can go back and look at these at any time, which is handy. So she wrote this one sentence: glasses and contact lenses are both a useful tool that everyone can have good eyesight immediately. So not a perfect sentence. There's a problem with that relative pronoun setup. So I use this code WW for wrong word. You could argue whether there's a better code for there, but I was still kind of learning how to use this myself. So she decided in her next draft to switch this to for which is still not quite the best answer, I think, but the fact that she realized that she can use a preposition plus a relative pronoun here, I think was a big step. And then I can go on with my next round of feedback and say, okay, this relative pronoun is okay, but let's think about this preposition. And on her test, she did change her answer for a very similar question. From which to in which, in this sentence, the box in which I put my money is gone. So that's an example of how indirect feedback can kind of help students change their thinking. How about Hikari? Another kind of example. She wrote, I think, such as badminton, tennis, table tennis. So that's not quite a good correction, or not quite a good sentence, rather. She would want to kind of break this down and put a noun here if she's using I think that something, such as badminton, tennis, table tennis. So I use this little arrow to show something missing. She decided to just delete such as and connect it to the noun badminton, which is also fine. But I expect that she did some thinking about how this sentence would be connecting and look up how think connects to other words in the sentence. And she did change her question in the test with regards to how to connect think. So from think that to think about their family and how to help them in this sentence. So that's another example of how indirect feedback might broaden students' thinking and cover more examples than what's just shown in this text. So let's get into some more qualitative analysis. So what did students think about the feedback types? I just asked for their opinion using this kind of 5-point scale. So their opinion on direct feedback was just good, and that's the highest they could have chosen. but keep in mind that's all they've been exposed to at the point of this survey. So that's all they know. Then when asked about indirect feedback, they have had experience with both at this point, and it's a little bit more split. Still generally positive, but not near the numbers of the direct feedback survey. So optional question, why did you like direct feedback? 13 people said, I can quickly see the solution. That's understandable. They're busy students. They've got a lot of homework in classes, busy social life. They'd like to just see where they made a mistake and try to learn and remember the new answer. I asked which feedback method was best, so kind of force them to choose one of these. 11 to 7 for direct feedback. So direct feedback edging it out a little bit. Optional question, why did you like indirect feedback? So 8 students said, I became able to use a variety of methods to search for answers. That was pretty interesting. I should also mention that I provided these 4 options again. So I'm kind of putting words in their mouth, but because it's an optional question, if they didn't agree with any of them, they can just skip it. 6 people said, if I fix the answer myself, it's easier to remember later. I kind of expected that one, but I didn't expect using a variety of methods to be so high. So I asked, what methods did you use? I kind of got this bunch of answers, and I tried to organize them here in a pie chart for you. So the most mentioned thing was electronic dictionary, which is understandable, especially for single words and spelling, but I don't think an electronic dictionary can solve most of the correction code-based errors. So the next popular was Google Translate, I think, and this might even be underrepresented just because I couldn't understand some of the answers I got here. But I should mention that I recommended several of these at the beginning of the semester. I recommended Google Translate and how to use it. I recommended weblio.jp and how to use it. I also recommended a bunch of English user interface websites like British Council and several websites that I myself learned Japanese with that I thought were helpful, but nobody mentioned those. So I think they really focus on websites and things with a Japanese user interface, kind of understandable. 2 people mentioned DMM Eikaiwa website, which I'd never heard of, but I checked it out. It looks to be actually a really useful resource. They've got a lot of different grammar points at different levels with listening. There's Japanese and English examples side by side. It's laid out pretty nicely with the Japanese interface. So I'll probably be recommending this website to my students next year. Maybe you could check it out too. So what were the issues? What was your main problem with indirect feedback? Optional question. 6 people said, I don't understand the codes very well. So that was a little disappointing for me. That means I didn't really teach them well enough how to use the codes. And I don't want that to be a main factor in their score in this class or their ability to improve their English. So from this point on, I tried to explain the codes more consistently throughout the semester. I tried to take a document with a bunch of correction codes and go through my process of how I would fix each one and even where I might find solutions for some of them. So I got extra results just a couple weeks ago. I asked students how much they agree with these statements. So I got used to using indirect feedback. Generally agree, which is pretty nice. And watching the teacher correct examples in class helped me. Also agree, even stronger, which is nice. I also asked students if they have any open comments about the class. I only got one. I'm not cherry picking this, but students said, by showing the example of others, I can make new discoveries. I think the indirect feedback is a good method for me. So that was nice to see. It's nice to know that me doing this in class was pretty useful. Okay, so my conclusions. My reflections on this process about direct feedback, I think it's usually easier and faster for the teacher. If I can look at it and understand what they meant to say, I can just highlight it and put in my correction. But we face the danger of putting words in a student's mouth, especially for longer sentences where we have to rewrite the whole thing. And the fact that this...
Sorry, Alex, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. The fact that the students who make more mistakes get more of their essay or paragraph rewritten is kind of a problem in my opinion. And I fear that students do not spend the required time to notice the corrections that I make for them. In my class setup, they don't really have a good reason to do that after they get the correction. For indirect feedback via correction codes, I think it takes more of my time to decide on the code and where to put it and physically input it, but technology is helping. I think it's a lot more easier than if I were to do it by hand. And I'm sure that there will be better software than what I'm using in the future to quickly input codes, if there isn't already. Selecting the correct code can be difficult, so I recommend trying to expand the code list whenever something like this happens, but just make sure that you can give examples and explain it to the students well before you start throwing it into the documents. Indirect feedback requires more teaching, many examples, and continuous reminders of how to use them, but I think I will continue using it. I feel that it's better. And I'm going to be looking for more quantitative actual statistical data to support this. So finally, my last benefits of using digital correction codes over written ones. It's easy to interject into a sentence. It's easy for students and teachers to read it. I had complaints when I used to do this by hand. My handwriting was pretty messy. It's easy to remove if you made a mistake or if the student fixed the code. And all of this saves time, space, and paper. So I really recommend people try using digital and computer-based writing classes to give feedback. So my final summary, I'll just go over this quickly and finish up so that we could get to questions if there are any. So thank you very much for listening, everyone. Thanks for coming and listening to my presentation. I really appreciate it. All right, if there's any questions, I'm open to taking them now. Thank you.
Can I ask for a round of applause first? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, either put your hand up or in the chat, participants, or quickly type it in the chat box, or maybe turn on your microphone and ask the question.
Anything? If not, maybe I'll go over my final summary slide.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
We have a question here. How many times a week does your class meet?
Oh, okay. Good question. We meet once a week.
Have you thought about, you said that students have trouble with the understanding the codes.
Yeah.
Have you thought about flipping that? So create little short 2-3 minute videos, uploading them and having students, direct students to those, watch those outside of class time. So it takes away from you teaching it in the class.
That's a good point. I haven't thought about that. Yeah, I'd like to do that, I think. I have to think about how I would make that video, but I'm sure there's examples out there I could see.
Yeah, really easy. Just have a sample text on your screen and just talk over it while you're recording the video.
Yeah, actually, that's what I've kind of been doing this year with my Zoom classes. I have a kind of on-demand portion where I do the lesson pre-recorded. So yeah, I could definitely keep using that after we get out of the coronavirus time.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions? Okay, please go ahead then, your final summary.
All right, so I'll just go over this quickly. So my quantitative analysis probably needs a larger sample size and number of test questions to give more solid information. The grammar points currently taught in the class and in the textbook are a little well too known for a pre and post test analysis, but there were some differences, potential differences between direct and indirect feedback's effectiveness shown. For my qualitative analysis, direct feedback seemed to be slightly more popular because the answer is known quickly. Indirect feedback was accepted, but the initial code instruction was probably insufficient. Students seemed to explore various resources, which was good, but they preferred those that had a Japanese language user interface. All right.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. I'm going to ask for one more round of applause. So everyone please unmute yourself if you're muted, and please give a round of applause to Alex Wright.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
And I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to recommend that